Watch me make Simplicity Pattern 8769 with pockets. Hi, I'm Heather Palapple. I'm relatively new to sewing. I've been sewing for about a year and a half, and I'm learning from YouTube videos and patterns, so this was the latest pattern I attempted to make, and I am very happy with the outcome. I hope you enjoy making this Simplicity pattern with me. First, cutting out pattern pieces and ironing them flat. Then spreading out the fabric and folding it in the right direction. Iron pattern pieces flat and arrange them on the fabric the way the instructions say. Piece 5 on my arrangement needed to be reflected, so I cut it out first and then mirrored it on the other side. I pinned everything carefully to make sure there's room in between to cut. Then cut around the outsides to refine later. My arrangement needed to use the other part of the fabric, so I cut the edge straight before I had my husband help me fold it the correct way, and then cut the fold so it was in two separate pieces. It took me a bit to figure out what the instructions were showing, and it turns out the top piece needed to be rotated, but the pieces needed to face each other, even though the image didn't show that. I then flattened the fabric and then ironed these pattern pieces. Then arranged them on the fabric as the instructions said. And just like the last part, I cut it out roughly, leaving some room to refine later. I had to iron my contrast fabric because it was very wrinkled, then folded and flattened it. I arranged the iron pattern pieces, pinned them on and cut them roughly, then refined all the cuts. The X-Acto knife did a great job cutting out all the tabs. Then my rotary pinking blade did the rest. And I made sure to mark all the lines and dots on the pattern. Once all that was done, it was time to sew. Step 1, stay stitch the side edge of piece 1. Make sure you start below the double notch and go up. Same with the other number 1 piece. I stay stitched a ½ inch from the edge on this project. Next, I pinned the inner edge of 1 and 2, being sure to line up both single notches. Then I sewed them together, making sure not to fold where it pinched. I found it a little difficult to sew where it curved. The instructions said to notch the edge and trim the seam, but I forgot to trim the seam. Then to press the seam open, which I found a little tricky here too. Step 2, I pinned the number 3 pieces together with right sides facing, then stitched together securely at 5/8. I did remember to trim the seam this time, and it was much easier to press the seam open here. Next, I stay stitched the neck edge a ½ inch from the edge, going from outside to in on both sides. Then I pin the number 4 pieces to either side, matching the notches, right sides facing each other. I stitch them together with 5/8 seam allowance and trim the seams. I made sure all the back seams were pressed open and pinned the front bodice pieces to the back piece with right sides together. We're pinning the tops of the shoulders and the sides. Match the notches. Sew the shoulders and sides securely with 5/8 seam allowance. Trim all the seams. Press them all open. And the next few steps, I forgot to film. Step 3 has you stay stitching the neck edge of the yoke and then stitching the shoulder pieces to the back piece. Step 4 has you sewing your decorative trim over the shoulder seam on the outside. In step 5, you're using an unzipped zipper as the trim. You pin the zipper to the outside facing in, folding carefully at the corners. Stitch them together as close to the teeth as possible. Press so tape is on the inside and teeth face out. And step 6 has you securely stitch around the zipper on the outside 1/4 inch from the teeth. Pin to the bodice matching dots and notches. Baste all the way around the edge just to hold everything together. Step 7, you double baste between the notches on either side of piece 6 and gather. With right sides together, pin the number 7 pieces on. Make sure dots and notches match. Adjust the gathering evenly so everything fits well. Stitch pin pieces together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure gathered areas stay even as you go. Trim the seams and press the seams towards the number 7 pieces. Step 8 are the pleats at the bottom of the hood. It took me a few tries to get this right. I ended up going the route of matching the image on the instructions versus the lines from the pattern. I pinned them and basted at a 1/2 inch to hold it together. I made sure the folds didn't get caught on the foot. That worked perfectly for me. Step 9. After pressing the long flat edge of piece number 8 towards the inside and pinning the other side to the front of the hood, I stitched it 3/8 inches from the edge. In step 10, I pressed the band out, pressing the seam towards the band. Then folded it inside and pinned the folded edge over the seam. I stitched from the outside to try to get the stitches in the ditch. I hoped it would make it look nice, but unfortunately the edge on the inside wasn't sewed on completely in a couple spots, and I had to go back and re-sew them. Then I pressed the band to make it look nice. I skipped step 11 because I liked how it looked. Finally, you can see how my yoke turned out. Step 12, pin hood to yoke right sides out. Make sure the centers, dots, and tabs match. I basted them at 1/2 inch to hold together. Step 12, iron on interfacing to all the number 5 pieces. I ended up ironing interfacing to all the tab pieces as well. Pin and securely stitch the back seams. 5/8 inches from the edge. Trim and press the seams open. Step 14, pin the 2 collar pieces right sides together. Stitch front and neck edges. Those are the unnotched edges. Trim the seam and corners. Step 15, turn the facing inside and press. Then top stitch 1/4 inch from the front and neck edges. Then baste the raw edges together. Step 16, make the tabs. The first page of the instructions has the steps. I never made tabs before, so there was a learning curve. I had trouble turning them inside out, but I figured out the back of my crochet hook did the trick. After turning them inside out, it was time to press. And I used my crochet hook to make sure the seams were stretched and everything looked nice and flat. Next, I trimmed the open edge and basted it. Then top stitch close to the finished edges. They turned out great. After all the tabs were done, I pinned them to the outside of the collar piece. Match the large dots, then baste each tab a 1/2 inch from the raw edge. Repeat on the other side. When I was done, I laid them out together to make sure they all lined up. Step 18, pin collar front edge of bodice with right sides together. Make sure centers and notches match, and baste all the way around. Trim the seam and clip the curves. Press the seam towards the bodice. Make sure you press the front and collar out, and here's where I messed up. The yoke and hood are supposed to be pressed up. Step 19, on the outside, securely top stitch 1/4 inch from the seam. Secure the tabs and work under the yoke, not over it like I did. Make sure you have a strong enough needle to sew through all the layers around the hood. Step 20. Apply interfacing to piece 21 and press under on the straight edge. Pin to piece 20 and stitch. Stitch along seam line and stitching lines. Take a couple extra stitches on the points to reinforce. The pattern lines and dots are very important on this part. Step 21. Carefully cut between the stitching to the point. Do not cut through the stitching, but you do need to cut as close to the point as you can. Trim the seam, clip the corners, and clip the curves. Step 22. Turn it inside out and press. Baste the raw edges together. I ended up pressing out of order, but it still worked. Then stitch close to the folded under edge. I pressed it one more time to make it nice and flat. Step 23, start by basting the shoulder on the sleeve twice without crossing so you can gather it. Then with the right sides facing, pin into a sleeve along the long edge matching the tabs. Securely stitch it 5/8 inches from the edge. Step 24, iron the interfacing. Fold in half lengthwise and pin with right sides together. Stitch 3/8 from the edge. Step 25, turn inside out, press and stitch to the edge. And apply the buckle on the flat end. Step 26, stitch tab to sleeve. Step 32, turn sleeve right side out and garment wrong side out. Pin sleeve to armhole edge. Base 1/2 inch around. Stitch 5/8 inch around, then stitch a second time to reinforce. Trim seam close to the stitching and press. Follow the instructions for step 34. Step 35, stay stitch upper edges of 22 and 23. Before going to step 36, I decided to add pockets. I cut out pieces to pocket size and measured marked openings. I stitched 3/8 inch across where pocket opening would be, and I folded and pressed the pocket out. Then I stitched on the outside close to the seam. Step 36, start pinning skirt pieces together at the top. With right sides together, pin the pocket pieces together. Mark seam allowance around the pocket. Start stitching skirt seam until pocket opening. With needle down, lift foot and turn fabric towards pocket as marked. Stitch pocket seam allowance as marked. Turn at the bottom corner. Stitch up to the bottom of the pocket opening. Turn 90 degrees and stitch a couple stitches. Turn 90 degrees again and stitch back around. 1/8 inch inside the seam for reinforcement. Pin the bottom of the pocket inside the skirt seam. And continue pinning down the seam. Starting at the bottom of the pocket opening, sew down 5/8 inch seam allowance. I backstitched and turned 90 degrees for a couple stitches into the bottom of the pocket. Trim seams and press open. Now pin the skirt sections with right sides together and stitch the back seam with 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim the seam and press open. Now base 5/8 inches from the lower edge of the skirt for the hem. Then step 37, pin bodice to upper edge of skirt. Make sure to match the seams and tabs. Securely stitch a 5/8 inch seam allowance and be careful not to sew in the pockets. Step 38, iron interfacing to piece 24. Stitch the long unnotched edge under 1/4 inch. Pin the facing over the inside of the bodice. Stitch across front facing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and connect the stitching with the previous stitching at the top. Sew the long edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim the lower edge section close to the stitching. Trim corners and seam. Step 39, turn facing inside and press. Press the bodice out and seam towards the skirt. Step 40, press up hem along the basting. Tuck up raw edge to meet the basting, pin and press. Then stitch the hem in place, pivoting at the corners. Work from end to end. This step was long and difficult for me. I worked on it over the course of days. I especially found the seams challenging with the heavy fabric I chose. But upon reaching the end, I realized it was worth all the effort, and I pressed the hem to give it a clean look. Step 41, on the outside I top stitched 1/4 inch from the edge. Make sure the stitching connects with the one above. It ended where the hem stitches did. Step 42, sew on the buckles for the bodice. And it's finished! I absolutely love how it turned out. It's so warm and it fits perfectly. And the hood is perfect too. I can't wait to try it in the rain. And I'm so glad I added pockets. I hope you enjoyed my video.